I will not move without a lawful reason.
This is procedure. This is authority.
Authority without reason is not safety. It is control.
Then you leave me no choice but to test your defiance.
The cabin froze, every passenger caught between breath and silence. Angela's words hung in the air like a lantern refusing to go out, while the captain's cold reply pressed down like iron. You could feel the weight of the moment an ordinary flight turned into a battle over dignity and power. The question was no longer just about a seat, but about who gets to decide what is right. And as the tension deepened, one truth became clear. The night was far from over. This is only the beginning. The next moment will strike harder and reveal even more. If you believe justice deserves a voice, leave a comment below with one word: justice. And don't forget to like and follow so you won't miss what happens next. The concourses at Chicago O'Hare carry the hush and hurry of late November, when families thought in recipes and reunions and travelers counted hours like prayer beads. Angela Carter moved within that tide as if she had all the time in the world, her scarf tucked neatly into her coat, her carry-on rolling without complaint. The air outside had the clean bite of early winter. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and coffee drifted from kiosks where paper cups stacked like small white chimneys. She paused at a cafe with brass pendant lamps and a glass case of pumpkin loaves, ordered a cappuccino in a steady voice, and set a modest tip into the jar with a quiet thank you that the barista returned with an honest smile. It was a kind of exchange that greased the Dano flourish, only grace. The season promised warmth at the end of every flight, but it also carried the strain of crowded gates and tired tempers. Angela could feel that pressure humming below the music on the speakers, below the flight announcements naming distant cities. A family nearby negotiated a stroller and 2 sleepy toddlers. A pair of college students argued amicably about football and pecan pie. A businessman in a crisp wool coat paced in a tight rectangle, his eyes darting between the boarding screen and the email on his phone, as if speed alone might bend time back into order. The world of travel always created such little theaters, each one a story that touched and parted in a breath. Angela's work rarely announced itself. She was a compliance professional whose mind held the trickiest parts of aviation law like a map she could fold and refold with one hand. She had come to love the quiet puzzles of rules and language, the way a single clause could safeguard dignity for strangers who would never learn her name. This evening, she would fly to Washington to prepare for testimony in a hearing that asked hard questions in calm voices. She had rehearsed the data and the phrases that made it usable. She wore that preparation as lightly as her scarf. Her cappuccino foamed like a small weather system in her cup. She took a seat by the window and opened her laptop, the screen warming her face with rows of text. The cafe filled with gentle motion napkins folded, lids fitted, a soft chorus of gratitude in many accents. Thanksgiving week made the airport an odd blend of intimacy and spectacle, like watching a town through a keyhole. Angela found comfort in its rhythm and the way courtesy could cut a neat path through the crowd. When the first boarding call came, something tugged slightly at the atmosphere, a string drawn between impatience and relief. Angela closed her laptop, slipped it into her tote, and paced herself to the gate, where a garland of paper leaves wrapped the column that held the departure sign. The agent scanned her phone and wished her a good evening. On another day, that simple kindness would have passed unnoticed. Tonight it landed and stayed, a small stone in the pocket of her mind. Inside the jet bridge, she matched steps with a businessman from the cafe. He muttered about a delayed dinner with partners in Washington, not so much to Angela as to whatever audience the air might provide. He used the sensible voice of a man who believed that schedules, like subordinates, owed him obedience. She gave him a courteous smile that did not invite conversation and kept walking. The cabin smelled faintly of lemon polish and coffee that had drifted forward from the galley. Angela turned left at the door and found her seat, 2 Alpha, by the window. The overhead bin held a neat row of carry-ons. She placed her tote above, settled her smaller bag under the seat, and folded her coat carefully. The cabin lighting glowed a quiet gold that flattered every color and forgave most sins. She slid into the window seat and pressed her palm to the cool oval of glass. Chicago's evening lay beyond it in blinking strands. Business travelers in the next row murmured about an earnings call scheduled for the next morning. A young couple, clearly upgraded for once-in-a-lifetime luck, whispered over a guidebook to the Capitol. The businessman, his name tag read Michael Turner, tugged his seatbelt with the briskness of someone correcting a subordinate. He glanced at Angela and then at her open tote, not unkindly, but with that slight ledger keeper's look that measures space and the use of it. A flight attendant welcomed passengers with the practiced lilt of calm competence. Her name, pinned to her navy vest, was Emily Rodriguez. She moved with a focus that came from many years of smoothing the edges no one noticed until they snagged. When she reached Angela's row, she offered a gentle greeting and asked whether Angela cared for water or juice while the cabin boarded. Angela chose water, then thanked her, the syllables as even as a metronome. Emily nodded and moved on, the thin car whispering over the carpet. Nothing dramatic announced itself, only that ordinary orchestra of boarding soundspins opening, laughter with too much edge, the rustle of coats surrendering to the overhead space. But even ordinary rooms can carry a seam that gives under the right pressure. Angela felt it in the way Turner's side grew more pointed each time the line slowed, in the sideways glances of a pair of men 2 rows back who paused a fraction too long on the side of her laptop and blazer. None of it amounted to anything that would trouble a report. Still, it registered. Small things have a way of accruing into stories. She placed her glass on the armrest and lifted the laptop again, not to work, but to keep her hands occupied while she listened for her own breath. She thought of her mother's cooking for the week ahead, the careful rituals that gathered people at a table and reminded them how grace could be practiced by habit. She remembered a colleague's phrase from an old conversation. Some days, justice wears house shoes. It walked around the room making space for everyone, and then asked, with a smile, whether we noticed. That thought steadied her in the cabin's faintly reverberant hush. The final wave of passengers filed into the business cabin just before the door closed. A young man in a university hoodie tucked into the aisle seat 2 rows behind Angela. He pulled out the phone, then looked up as if surprised to find himself in public. He smiled to no one in particular and pocketed the device again, as if reminding himself to be present. Across the aisle, a grandmotherly woman with a silver knit scarf eased down with the care of someone who has learned the language of her own bones. She folded her hands and watched the flight attendants with open admiration. Michael Turner returned to his phone, speaking to it with the volume of a man who did not believe in leaving things to the imagination. His dinner in Washington could not be moved, he said, because the men at the table had other planes to catch, other rooms to fill. The word men did more work than it needed to do. It drew a border around who gets accommodated when time becomes expensive. Angela let the sound pass through her and looked out at the tarmac where a light dusting of flurries began to halo the floodlights. The weather was the kind that looked worse than it was the soft, indecisive snow that made for beautiful photographs in ordinary delays. She liked the way it softened edges without covering them up. She lifted the safety card, read it the way she always did, then slid it back with a small nod of respect for those who had designed it to be useful in a moment when no one would have time to read. A memory brushed her mind, an old training module that cautioned crews against weaponizing authority when patience would do. It was the sort of language that sounds abstract until you realize that every sentence in the manual is someone else's story with the names sended off. She had annotated that module once, years ago, with the note, "Courtesy is a form of safety." She believed it then, she believed it now. Boarding ebbed to silence. Overhead bins clicked shut in a line of polite percussion. The door closed with a seal that felt official. A flight attendant in economy gave the thumbs up forward. Emily checked belt and bags with the efficient glance of experience. Angela wrapped both hands around her water glass, felt the cool through the plastic, and set it back into the holder. Her phone, tucked into airplane mode, held a text from a colleague that read simply, "Travel safe." She typed a reply that she did not send, "You too." The world had become a place where even kindness required timing. In the row cross, the grandmother in the silver scarf unfolded a napkin from her purse and placed a small bag of roasted nuts on it as if she were setting a table on a mountain ledge. She looked toward Angela and offered a soft nod, a greeting that asked nothing and gave something anyway. Angela returned it with gratitude that did not need words. Two young men behind them compared notes on connecting trains from Reagan. National One mentioned a metro stop by a museum, speaking the city's map like a story he was eager to walk. From the cockpit came the faint impression of voices' routine words with the exactness of a ritual. Angela liked that sound. It meant that people were doing their jobs the way instruments do, with attention tuned to a single wavelength. The captain's doors do the way such doors always do. An ordinary panel whose plainness is the point. One did not look for drama at a door designed to refuse it. She fastened her bag under the seat and slid her shoes back on, the better to stand if courtesy requested it. She checked that her seat back pocket held what it should hold, not because she needed anything now, but because order calmed her. The businessman beside her released another of those pointed sighs, the kind that made sympathy a little tired. A child somewhere far back giggled at something the airplane did that adults could no longer hear. Angela reached down and drew the seatbelt across her lap, the metal cool in her hand, and tightened it with the easy motion of a person who has flown often and trusts the logic of simple precaution. She smoothed the edge of her sweater and looked once more at the snow like pale confetti at a parade no one planned. As Angela finished tightening her seatbelt, the navy blue uniform of the captain appeared right before her. Captain Thomas Blake stopped at the edge of the aisle and let the hush settle around him like a uniform he had worn for decades. The gold bars at his shoulder caught the cabin lights. His jaw held the stillness of a man used to closing arguments with a look. He glanced at the seat map on the bulkhead, then at the window seat where Angela Carter sat with her toe tucked neatly below, her coat folded with deliberate care. His voice arrived without preamble, low and formal, as if it had already been cleared for takeoff. Ma'am, this seat will need to be given up. The air shifted by a degree, the way a room does when weather moves in. A few passengers looked up from tablets and newspapers. One of them, Michael Turner, in the aisle seat across, leaned back with a small exhale that said he had been waiting for the world to recognize urgency. Emily Rodriguez, the lead flight attendant, paused 2 rows away with a tray of waters poised in her hands, her eyes measuring courtesy against command. The grandmother in the silver scarf folded her hands more tightly, as though to keep them from speaking before her mouth did. Behind them all, the steady domestic clatter of boarding had ended. There was only the quiet of people listening for which way a decision might lean. Angela felt the weight of the words without flinching. She looked up at him with composure one brings to the one question that matters on a long drive. Where are we, exactly? Good evening, she said, offering him the first step any conversation needs. 2. Alpha is my assigned seat. Blake did not move closer, as if proximity might concede something he never conceded. We have an operational need to reassign this role, he said. I will need you to move to the rear so we can settle another passenger up here. The words arrived wrapped in professionalism, but they carried a note of something older, as if the seat itself had to be reminded how status worked. Angela reached for her boarding pass and laid it gently on the tray table between them so that the name and seat were visible. This is the seat listed here, she said, and on my reservation. Michael Turner tipped a shoulder toward them. If it gets us out on time, maybe we all make a little room, he suggested into the air, the tone designed to sound helpful while assigning blame to whoever might resist. Across the aisle, a pair of business travelers exchanged a look that said the evening could go either way. Emily stepped forward into the space where things become either a request or a demand. Mom, she said, and her voice held a softness Angela respected. If you would be willing to switch, we might be able to avoid a delay. I can offer a drink when we're airborne, and I will make sure you have what you need. Angela met her eyes with kindness first, because the work of service is heavy and deserves that. I appreciate the offer, she said. If there's a safety reason for this change, I will, of course, comply. If not, I would like to remain in the seat I purchased. Blake's gaze sharpened by a fraction. I am the captain, he said. When a change is necessary, I make it. A beat of quiet formed and rolled down the aisle. The young couple with the guidebook stopped whispering. The hum of ventilation sounded louder. A toddler far back let out a soft echo of surprise and then went silent. Turner's phone glowed face down on his tray, as if the device itself had decided to be polite for once. Angela rested her hands on the edge of the tray, steady without show. Respectfully, she said, "Your authority is absolute when safety is at issue. If you're declaring a safety issue related to my presence in the seat, I will move." Emily glanced at Blake, the way a junior officer reads the wind. She turned back to Angela with a compromise ready on her lips. "We do not want to inconvenience you," she said, "but if you could help us tonight." Turner cut in, impatient faith in hierarchy animating his voice. "We all have places to be," he said. "It is the holidays. If the captain says move, let us move and get going." Angela kept her voice level, like a line drawn with a good ruler. "I am not refusing cooperation," she said. "I am asking for the reason that makes it lawful." Blake's face did not redden. That would have conceded too much to biology. It hardened. He looked down the aisle, then back to the name on the boarding pass, as if it had spoken an argument he disliked. "We have a passenger who must sit here," he said. "I do not need to explain operational details." "Captain," Angela said, and she gave the word its full due. "I understand operations. If there is a balance issue, a medical reason, or a specific safety requirement, please say so. Otherwise, this becomes a question of preference. Preference is not the standard." Silence arranged itself over the cabin in tidy squares. Emily held her breath and then let it go. The grandmother in the silver scarf looked down at her folded hands. A young man in a college hoodie 2 rows back shifted slightly, as if to see better, then settled again. Far forward, the flight deck murmurs continued with their bland, reassuring cadence. Blake addressed the cabin, not loudly but with the practiced reach of a person used to PA systems. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we are attempting to make a seating change that will allow us to depart in a timely manner. Your cooperation is appreciated." It was not the full thunder of the overhead speakers, but it was enough to send a small wash of pressure down the rows. Turner sat up straighter, pleased to hear gravity speaking with the force of rank. Somebody muttered something about people always making it harder than it needed to be. The business traveler across the aisle cleared his throat in a way that suggested a policy preference. Angela did not match volume with volume. She slid the boarding pass back into its sleeve and folded her hands with the same care the grandmother had shown her nuts and napkin. "I am happy to accommodate safety," she said to Emily, "and to accept an inconvenience for the good of the flight. I will not accept an unlawful order." "Long-wei," the word unlawful landed with a soft click, like a buckle finding its home. Emily's eyes flickered. The training modules she had studied for years rose in the back of her mind, pages that said in gentle fonts what to do and not do. She understood more than she could say, and she was not the one authorized to say it. Blake shifted his weight the width of a shoe, a movement that carried the argument forward by a small, consequential step. "I will not argue regulations with a passenger," he said. "You will move now." Angela's tone did not rise. It grounded. "Then please state the safety basis, Captain." Turner leaned into the silence like a man squeezing a horn. "We are wasting time," he said. "Some of us have dinner with clients in Washington. It is not personal. It is practical." Angela turned her head just enough to include him without ceding focus. "Sir, practicality without principle is how people get used," she said gently. "I am not here to be a lesson for anyone. I am here to fly to work." He blinked, perhaps surprised by the absence of heat. He glanced away, as if the window might offer a script more to his liking. The grandmother looked up and met Angela's eyes with a small nod that held decades in it. Emily set the tray on a galley latch and stepped a half-pace closer, her voice lower now, meant for 2 but audible to 5. "If this escalates, we may have to return to the gate," she said. "No one wants that." "That is why clarity matters," Angela answered. "If there is no safety reason, returning to the gate becomes a report, not a necessity." Blake considered the galley phone, then decided against turning his back. "You are obstructing a crew instruction," he said. "I can have you removed, and I can document the basis," Angela said, still even, still present. "If there is no safety concern, removal becomes retaliation." Something in the cabin's temperature changed. Not warmer, not colder, just truer. People who had been half a conversation away leaned in by a fraction, The pair of business travelers across the aisle pressed their lips together in a way that suggested a meeting in their minds about risk. Emily's fingers tightened on the edge of the card, then eased. Angela sat a little taller, not to take space, but to mark it. I respect your role, she said to Blake. I respect this crew. I will follow a lawful order immediately. Blake drew a breath meant to reset the shape of the moment. Instead, the moment kept its shape and asked him to fit it. He let the breath out through his nose and chose a new angle. There is a passenger of importance who needs this seat. The word importance loosened the knot more than he expected. A few heads lifted. Someone behind Angela made the small sound people make when a story becomes obvious. Turner, who had been waiting for a reason he recognized, nodded as if a ledger had balanced itself. Emily's gaze flicked down. She did not relish the ground opening under her shoes. Captain, Angela said, and the softness in the word kept it respectful. Importance is not a safety category. For a heartbeat, the cabin held nothing but ventilation and the patience of strangers. Then, from 2 rows behind, a voice arrived, older and steady. She is right, the grandmother said, not loudly but with the conviction of a person who has placed her body in doorways so other people could pass. Let the rules be the rules. Turner turned half around, surprised to see history sitting so close. He did not speak. Emily wet her lips and tried once more with courtesy. Ma'am, if you would accept a comparable seat, I will personally ensure you are comfortable. I will also write a note for customer care on your behalf. Thank you, Angela said, and she meant it. If you can tell me the safety reason, I will move. If not, I will remain. That is the line I'm required to keep. Blake's patience found its floor. He leaned in just enough that the stripes at his shoulder rolled higher. You will comply, he said, a final time, as if the sentence itself could do the work. Angela's answer arrived with no edges. Then say the safety reason, she repeated, and in her repetition there was not defiance, only insistence that the ground be named before they walked on it. Around them, the cabin changed posture. Tablets went dark, newspaper pages stilled. Even the people who disliked conflict liked integrity when it asked for nothing but daylight. In that hush, the shape of the room shifted. A diagram of authority now included the rectangle of a woman's seat as a point that could not be moved without a reason that would stand up outside this metal tube. Blake straightened, as if told by a hand at his back that he had reached the limit of persuasion. Very well, he said, and his voice grew cool as polished glass. If you continue to refuse, we will resolve this as policy directs. Angela's hands remained folded. I am ready to follow policy, she said. All of it. The overhead lights did not flicker. The engines did not surge. Nothing dramatic answered the exchange. Only the simple honesty of a system being asked to be itself. Emily's eyes shone for an instant with something like relief. The way truth, once said aloud, can feel like fresh air even when it complicates the day. Outside the window, the flurries had thickened into a curtain fine enough to blur the nearest service truck and pretty enough to make poetry of the lights. Inside, the captain's silence made hollow the size of a decision. Turner looked at his hands and smoothed an invisible wrinkle from his sleeve. The grandmother breathed in and out as if measuring the length of the moment with her lungs. The quiet deepened until you could hear the faint clink of a glass in the galley and the rubber-soft whisper of a cartwheel shifting its weight. Somewhere behind them, a zipper purred as someone tucked a bag a little farther under a seat in case enforcement arrived not as reason, but as ritual. At the front, Emily lifted the interphone, then set it down again, choosing for one more beat to let dialogue work. Angela looked at the captain and thought of the line between cooperation and surrender. How easily people confuse the one for the other when power asks. She did not narrow her eyes or tilt her chin. She only stayed. The air answered by becoming clearer about itself, as if the cabin had been waiting to be told its own name. The captain's teeth set for an instant, a small sign from a man who had learned to keep larger ones out of sight. He drew himself up, and the aisle seemed to shorten. He glanced past Angela, perhaps toward the flight deck door, perhaps toward a future he preferred to announce rather than meet. The hush grew heavier, the light more definite on the curve of the window. the sense of time more precise. A young student 2 rows back unexpectedly raised a phone to record a video. Jason Juan eased back into his seat and let the edge of curiosity settle into focus. He had promised himself to stay present, to look up from his phone and notice life as it unfolded, but the quiet in the business cabin felt like a stage waiting for a cue. Moments ago, the captain's request had slipped into the air like a cold draft, and the answer had landed with the soft certainty of law. The temperature of the room had changed. It reminded Jason of a remark his aunt once made while pouring tea, that the most important things are often spoken in the calmest voice. He remembered that now and felt the tug to witness, not to sensationalize, but to hold a record that could be checked by daylight. The aircraft sat at the gate with its pulse steady, a long breath held between door and runway. Outside the small windows, early winter made the floodlights shimmer through a light veil of snow. The cabin lights cast a gentle gold on navy fabric and brushed aluminum. A flight attendant secured a galley latch with a soft click of a habit practiced 1,000 times. A child's laugh rose from far back and disappeared into the upholstery, replaced by the hum of ventilation. The business cabin was full of small rituals. A page turned carefully, a coffee cup nursed like a promise, a coat folded and refolded by someone who liked order. In that ritual, quiet words mattered. Jason felt his phone in his hand the way a violinist feels a bow, not as a toy, but as an instrument that could sing or screech, depending on the intention behind it. He opened the camera, then paused, checked the lens with a thumbprint wipe, and opened the live stream with a caption no sharper than necessary. He spoke under his breath, more to steady himself than to stir anyone up. He had watched too many clips where heat outran truth. Tonight he wanted the reverse. At the window, Angela Carter kept her posture composed, her hands resting lightly on the tray table as if holding a page that should not flutter. There was nothing theatrical about her stillness. It read as steadiness, the kind people bring to appointments with doctors and judges. She had answered the captain without rudeness, drawing a clear boundary and refusing to move it with anything but safety. To Jason, that single act felt like a lesson in how power should be met, not with volume, but with exact words. Across the aisle, Michael Turner shifted in a way that made his suit creak. The earlier confidence had thinned. He was not yet contrite, and perhaps he would not be, but he looked away when the cabin grew too quiet, as if the window had offered a version of himself he preferred. 2 business travelers sat with their hands on their knees, as if preparing to stand at a hearing. The grandmother in the silver scarf watched with the patience of age. Emily Rodriguez, the lead flight attendant, stood within arm's reach of Angela and the captain, her eyes moving between them the way a nurse watches a monitor, listening for the beat that means go on. The stream found its rhythm. Comments appeared in soft lines that the app did not shout. Some viewers asked what had happened, and Jason answered in the plainest words he could find. A passenger had been asked to move from a seat she had purchased. She had politely asked for the safety reason that would make such an order valid. None had been given. A few viewers typed versions of "You Go," but most asked for details. He gave them. He kept his voice low, not because he was afraid, but because the cabin deserved the courtesy of being a room and not a stadium. The captain had not raised his voice either. He did not need to. Rank spoke through him the way wind speaks through a flag, but something in his stance suggested that the conversation no longer moved according to the map he preferred. He stood a half step back, the curve of the aisle doming above his shoulders. He breathed in as if to address the cabin again, then changed his mind. It was a small decision, and yet it seemed to rewrite the temperature by a degree. Emily cleared her throat softly and spoke to Angela with a gentleness that acknowledged the weight of her job. "I want this to be the kind of night you barely remember," she said. "Not the kind you tell stories about." Angela gave her a nod that meant she understood and did not blame. Jason felt a pang of admiration for both the worker caught between manual and conscience, and the traveler who refused to shrink. Turner made a little circle with his palm over the face of his phone, as if winding time. "We all want to leave," he said to no one in particular. "We all have places to be." He did not add the rest, that some people's places counted more in certain rooms, because that had been the assumption all along. The words that mattered were already on the record. The cabin's sense of balance changed when a low, calm voice emerged from behind Angela. "Captain," it said. Robert Hayes, gray at the temples and straight-backed, rose with the economy of someone who has spent decades learning how to stand in a moving room. "I flew long enough to know the difference between preference and procedure. Unless there is a safety concern tied to this passenger seat, a reassignment on request is not standard. You know that." Those last 3 words did not challenge the captain's competence. They called him to it. Emily's shoulders eased a millimeter, as if the room had finally said aloud what her training kept insisting. The captain turned just enough to include Hayes in his field of view. "We are working toward an on-time departure," he said, "and occasional adjustments are necessary." It was the kind of sentence that could be repeated at many gates and mean nothing until the wrong person had to pay for it. Jason narrated quietly for the stream. A retired pilot had spoken. He had cited procedure and placed the request inside the frame of law. The comments came in like a tide made of words. The audience did not shout. They asked who the passenger was, whether she had remained courteous, whether the airline had offered a comparable seat for a reason that would hold up. Jason answered each carefully. He refused to attach names when he did not need to. He did not add adjectives that would make the story catch faster and burn out sooner. The numbers on the screen climbed in steady increments. It was not a bonfire. It was a lantern. Angela looked past the captain for a heartbeat, not to gather allies but to collect herself. She had seen deference used like a broom to clear a path for someone else to take her place. She knew what it felt like to be treated as a variable instead of a constant. Yet she had chosen her words as constants tonight. She had placed them on the tray table between herself and an order that would not name its cause. Emily took another step closer and spoke at a register that felt like a hand offered palm up. "If we can keep this from escalating," she said, "we can keep the inconvenience small." Angela met her halfway without moving an inch. "I agree," she said. "The least escalation is the truth. Somewhere aft, a passenger coughed, a dry reminder that bodies have their own little emergencies. A service truck rumbled briefly against the skin of the airplane, a joint sound heard in 2 worlds at once. Jason described none of that into the stream. He let the camera show the geometry of the room, the angle of a captain's shoulder, the poise of a seated woman, the angle of a veteran's chin, the tremble and stilling of a flight attendant's hands. The pressure that had gathered at the ceiling began to descend toward the floor where it could do less harm. Angela's neighbors leaned back, as if making space for something formal to occur. Turner stared at a spot on his tray table with the concentration of a man adjusting a narrative in his head. Hayes remained standing but softened his stance by a degree, an old habit borrowed from cockpit chairs where collaboration saves more days than authority. The captain spoke again, this time to the air rather than to any one person. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "your cooperation is essential. We have a situation with a non-compliant passenger." The word non-compliant landed in the cabin with more weight than he intended. It is a word that belongs in checklists, where bolts and valves either meet spec or do not. Applied to a person who had purchased a seat and remained in it, the word wrapped order around the feeling and called the bundle policy. Angela did not look away from him. "I am compliant with every lawful request," she said in a voice that would have sounded the same if they were discussing the temperature of the coffee. "I will follow a safety order immediately." Jason repeated those lines for the audience, because words like that can disappear if they are not heard twice. The stream count ticked upward. He called the number out only once, not as a cheer, but as a note for the record. More than 50,000. He could feel a responsibility turn and face him, as if asking what kind of witness he planned to be. He steadied his breath and decided, out loud, to let the lens sit. The comments slowed their advice and asked for patience instead. The grandmother in the silver scarf shifted and placed both feet flat on the floor. She did not speak yet. Her silence gathered meaning like a garment woven in front of everyone. Angela had noticed her earlier and took a kind of comfort from the way the older woman's presence drew a circle of respect inside the cabin. It felt like a choir forming without rehearsal. One committed voice, then another, then a third, and soon the room holds harmony without a conductor. The pressure of minutes did what minutes always do on airplanes. It turned attention to clocks and connections. Turner exhaled a sentence about dinner that he did not finish. A young couple whispered about the metro as if they could plan their way through a night that had not chosen its shape. Emily offered water down the row and received several polite no thank yous that felt like people choosing dignity as their beverage. When the captain stepped back, he did not retreat so much as make room for a choice. He could call for security. He could stand there and argue until authority itself looked thin. He could confer with Emily within sight of everyone and risk the impression of an appeal. He did none of those things in that instant. He let the quiet draw a box around the next move. Jason held the phone steady. He did not pan or zoom. He let the image breathe. In the comments, a veteran wrote that he had seen this before in other uniforms with other names, that the test was always whether power could admit that it did not need to be right to be safe. A teacher typed that she would play this for her civics class, not to indict, but to ask how rules and people meet. A grandfather wrote that he was watching from his living room and that he had once been asked to leave a place he had a right to be. He wanted his grandchildren to hear the soft edge in the woman's voice that did not break. The cabin understood what a room understands when something true has been said. People adjusted their shoulders toward the center, which is where a community lives. Hayes cleared his throat, not as a warning but as a permission. Emily flicked her gaze to the interphone and then back to the door, calculating the path that would let procedure and kindness walk side by side. Angela rested her hands on the tray table like a person holding a book open to the page that matters and waiting for the rest of the class to arrive. Jason's breath fogged his phone for a second. He wiped it with his sleeve and wondered if the moment required more of him than a steady hand. He chose not to narrate judgment. He chose to archive behavior. In a world that often mistakes runtime for substance, he would let the record run at the speed of truth. Out on the ramp, a wingtip light blinked its steady code into the snowy air. Somewhere in the forward galley, a glass tapped, another by accident, and then settled. The captain's jaw tightened and eased. The room took note of it the way a choir knows the breath of its soloist. What had been simple delay now felt like a threshold. The question was no longer whether the cabin would depart on time, but whether it would depart intact. Angela's eyes moved once to Emily in a look that signaled both gratitude and readiness. She had not raised her voice, she had not dramatized her status, she had made a single request named the reason and trusted it to be heavy enough. As the cabin came to rest around that weight, something like respect knit itself through the rows, thin but strong. It looked from Jason's lens like a room remembering what it was for. He did not see the grandmother stand, not yet. He saw only the slightest motion, a hand reaching up to the soft silver knit at her neck, the fabric catching the light. The stream's comments stalled, the way even digital crowds can hold their breath. He glanced up and saw her eyes, bright and unafraid, set on Angela with a focus that made the aisle feel like a chapel. Then he lowered the phone by a fraction, as if to give the moment the dignity of being seen without interruption. Martha Johnson gently loosened her silver knit scarf, her eyes fixed on Angela, ready to speak. Snow sifted across the tarmac as if the night had shaken a pillow over the lights. Inside the business cabin, the hush felt deliberate, a kind of ceremonial pause that happens when a community stands close to a line and wonders which side will name it. Angela Carter drew her laptop from the tote with the care one uses for a fragile instrument. The hinge opened on a soft note, the screen climbed out of black and warmed her face. Her fingers hovered a breath above the keys, then began their steady procession. She did not peck or perform, she documented. She titled the file in plain language that no one could mistake and began with the quiet bones of any proper account. Flight, gate, city, aircraft, crew positions observed. She did not add color. She added facts. She described the request for her to surrender the window seat she had purchased and confirmed that no safety reason had been stated. She recorded the names that were visible on badges and the approximate times anchored to events anyone could corroborate. She cited the federal standard that ties relocation to safety and safety alone, then flagged the sentence that requires a record whenever authority is exercised over a passenger. A single line break, then another, then a paragraph in which she affirmed her readiness to comply with any safety order and her refusal to obey an order that could not be located in law. Captain Thomas Blake watched like a man listening for a leak he insisted did not exist. The stripes at his shoulders looked heavier than they had a few minutes before. He cleared his throat, searching for the register that turns doubt into obedience. "You will not make a spectacle of this," he said, with the practiced calm of a person whose sentences are accustomed to becoming rooms. Angela did not look up. "This is not spectacle," she said. "This is a contemporaneous record." Ray goes in. Robert Hayes, the retired pilot, remained standing. The posture read neither defiant nor dramatic. It read like competence called from the bench. "Captain," he said, and his voice carried the distance between instruction and example. "She is building the kind of report any professional would welcome in a review. If there is a safety basis, say it and we go. If there is not, we stop before the error becomes two." Emily Rodriguez stood a pace off Angela's shoulder. It was the kind of position that belongs to care. Close enough to help, far enough to avoid crowding dignity. She chose her words with the gentleness of someone who has studied manuals not just as rules, but as promises. "I know you do not want to sing," she told Angela. "I also know you are within your rights to ask. Tell me what you need from me right now." Witness Angela answered. "A clear description of what you have seen and heard, as you would give it to your supervisor or to the department that handles crew conduct." Emily nodded once, sober and grateful that someone had translated a storm into steps. "I can do that," she said. Michael Turner sank a little lower in his seat, his earlier confidence rubbing thin. He glanced at his watch, then at nothing, then at the window, as if time might be persuaded by a view. He started to say something about dinner and stopped, the sentence folding in on itself before he drew breath. Across the aisle, two business travelers traded a look that felt like a vote for proceedings to be conducted in daylight. Jason Nguyen held his phone steady at chest height. He narrated in a voice that never rose above library volume. He gave the stream what it needed: time, place, the words spoken, and none of what it often asks for, which is heat. In the comments, a nurse wrote that she had watched families sign consent forms they did not understand, that she had learned what calm can do when someone insists on reasons. A bus driver typed that rules kept cities from coming apart and that rules without reasons were just habits and uniforms. Jason read the sentences and let them pass through him without becoming his own. Martha Johnson, the grandmother in the silver scarf, stood with the room's permission. She used the armrest to rise and set both feet squarely, a stance that had served her in doorways and on sidewalks and in rooms where air once weighed more than it does now. Her eyes found Angela the way a lighthouse finds a ship. "We have been quiet a long time," she said, voice low, carrying. "We have made way and made way again. Tonight, let the way be made for what is right. Let the rule be the rule." The sentence landed softly and yet rearranged weight. The passengers who had been pretending not to watch watched openly now. Emily's shoulders eased a fraction. Hayes bowed his head in acknowledgement, as if he had just heard exactly the right brief. Turner resisted the urge to argue with a woman who might have been his mother's sister. He looked instead at his hands. There is a quiet man learned in the presence of women who have carried longer distances than they have. Blake turned a degree toward Martha, respectful without conceding. "Ma'am, I do not intend disrespect," he said. "I intend an on-time departure, and I intend that we leave with our dignity intact," Martha answered, as gently as a prayer. Angela's fingers continued to mark the account. She included Martha's words and the point at which they were spoken, not for flavor, but because language shapes rooms and rooms shape outcomes. She recorded Hayes' statement about procedure and the captain's repeated refusal to name a safety basis. She described Emily's offer to document events. She kept the sentences free of adjectives and full of verbs. She believed in verbs. They proved that people moved when it mattered. Snow slid past the window in thin veils. A service truck idled, then rolled away. The night pressed its cool palm against the fuselage as if to take a temperature. Inside, breath and fabric made a modest orchestra. No one raised a voice, and yet the cabin felt loud with a single idea. Power is at its best when it explains itself. Blake shifted, searching for a door that would open with a key he owned. "Ma'am," he said to Angela, "you are interfering with crew operations." "I am documenting them," Angela said. "If you have a safety order, give it, and I will move. If not, the interference is yours." Hayes did not smile, but his eyes brightened a degree, as if a clean instrument had just been calibrated. Emily folded her hands and watched the captain as a person watches a loved one deciding whether to step through the right door before pride locks the wrong one. Turner pressed his lips together. He had been in rooms where someone used a title like hammer. He was learning, perhaps for the first time, what it would take to set the hammer down. Jason described the exchange without coloring it. In the stream, a veteran from a different branch wrote that the most useful thing he ever learned was how to say, in plain speech, "I hear you, and here are the rules." A teacher wrote that she will use this clip to talk about the difference between cooperation and surrender. The numbers rose again, but no one said the word that often turns bodies into a crowd. It felt less like a mob than a meeting. Angela finished the section on immediate facts and began a new paragraph under the heading Intended Actions. She wrote that she would submit the account through the airline's formal portal and through the federal process that accepts passenger reports. She wrote that she would attach any available witness statements and video evidence if requested by the proper authority. She wrote that she remained willing to comply with any instruction necessary for safety or security, and that she would not comply with an instruction grounded in preference, status, or convenience. Her hands did not shake. Blake tried one more angle. "We have a very important passenger who needs this seat," he said. "There are operational partnerships at stake." He left the noun unspoken, but the cabin heard it anyway. There's a word for people whose needs are assumed to matter more. Angela looked up at him at last, not with challenge, but with the patience one offers a colleague who knows better. "Importance is not a safety category," she said. The grandmother's hands rested on the top of her seat back, small and steady. "It never was," she added, almost to herself. Emily moved a half step, aligning herself at Angela's side. It was not dramatic. It simply made a new diagram in which service stood beside the person who had asked for the rule to be named. "Captain," she said, voice level, "we can return to the gate and consult policies in writing. It may be better than proceeding in error." For a moment, Blake's eyes showed the strain of a man trying to keep a bridge from swaying by will alone. Pride prefers momentum to correction, but the room had slowed to the pace of reason, and reason kept its footing in snow. He looked down the aisle to the open door of the flight deck and then back to the passenger who had written herself into the record as calmly as one ties a shoe. Angela rested her fingers beside the keyboard and spoke to the cabin, not loudly, but so that the front rows and the rows behind could hear without leaning. "As of this moment," she said, "I am initiating a formal record for review. This flight is now under audit." The syllables did not crackle. They ran. The sound of them found the bones of the aircraft and seemed to settle there. Jason felt his hands go still around the phone. In the comments, punctuation gave way to complete sentences and names. People introduced themselves: a teacher, a retired mechanic, a grandmother in Detroit, and wrote a single line each, as if signing a ledger. Hayes nodded once, like a judge satisfied that the hearing had been properly opened. "That is accurate," he said. "Documentation is not defiance. It is discipline." He reached into his jacket, withdrew a pen, and held it in his palm as if offering a tool anyone could use. "I will sign my statement when we land." Turner's shoulders eased down. He had been waiting for someone to tell him which value to applaud. The grandmother smiled without showing teeth. Emily's breath left her in a way that made the air smell fresher. Blake's jaw flexed and released, a tide hitting a wall and sliding back into itself. Angela saved the document twice, not from fear of loss, but from respect for work. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat and opened them to the small theater of faces arranged around her seat. She looked at Emily with gratitude already composed. She looked at Hayes with the kind of respect people give the elders of a craft. She met Martha's gaze and saw there the opposite of surprise. Some rooms are built to see a moment coming and to welcome it when it arrives. Snow pulsed across the window like quiet applause. Somewhere forward, a flight attendant set a glass down and it chimed against the counterslip. In economy, a child hummed a tune that did not belong to any season but sounded exactly like peace. The seconds lengthened into their proper size. Angela straightened the edge of the boarding pass and rested her hand beside the laptop, ready to add the next line when the next line happened. Blake lifted his chin. the way a man will when he is about to give an order to a machine that always obeys. He looked at the interphone, at the aisle, at the door to the world beyond the cabin. He reached for the handset with a motion as smooth as any he had made that day and pressed the key that turns a person into a voice that fills a room. The cabin speaker sounded, "Ladies and gentlemen, please be advised. Our departure is delayed while we address an onboard issue," and Thomas Blake's voice trembled with lost control. Snow pressed gently against the window as if asking permission to stay. The cabin held its breath after the captain's announcement, the words still hanging like frost in the air. Emily Rodriguez steadied the service card with one hand and looked from the handset to Angela Carter, then to the faces around them. What began as scattered sympathy coalesced, quiet as a tide. A businessman in the second row cleared his throat and said into the hush that courtesy belonged to everyone on a plane, not only to those who wore stripes. A woman traveling with her sister nodded and added that seats were not favors. The sound was not loud, but it gathered density. People leaned, shoulders angled toward Angela rather than away. You could feel the center of the room move. Angela did not stand to claim it. She sat where she was, hands resting near the closed laptop, the boarding pass aligned with the table's edge. She answered a soft question from the aisle with one sentence. She would move the instant a safety reason was stated. The sentence carried calm, and calm carried weight. A man in the third row, the kind who reads newspapers even when the phone is easier, murmured that he had always believed in the rules because rules keep strangers from becoming opponents. His neighbor said the rule had been named, and the rule favored the passenger. The words stacked like bricks. Michael Turner sank into the shape of a listener. He dreamed from his posture. He had built a case around the urgency of his dinner, but urgency looked smaller against the scale of principle. He rubbed his thumb along the rim of his cup and watched the pattern of condensation his hand made. If he had something to say, he let it rest. Respect, after all, is also a schedule. Jason Wen kept the lens steady. He spoke in low phrases that did not step on the room. He gave the audience the facts and let the soundscape do its work. The modest clatter from the forward galley, the regular sigh of ventilation, the prayers of people who do not often use that word. Comments scrolled in complete sentences from workers who knew how authority can wander, and from elders who had taught shops and classrooms and bus routes that fairness is a skill. Jason took care not to narrate anyone's heart. He gave the stream the map and trusted the viewers to walk it. Robert Hayes stood as if asked to recite a creed. He did not point. He did not dramatize. He allowed history to speak from the small, plain stage of his body. "Captain," he said, "I flew long enough to know how these moments go wrong. You are not safer when you are broader than the rule. You are safer when you stand inside it." The words landed as instruction rather than accusation, and the cabin recognized the difference. Martha Johnson stayed on her feet a moment longer, her silver knit scarf settling against her shoulder like a ribbon from another campaign. "Child," she said toward Angela, though the whole room heard, "you have held your square, let the rest of us hold ours." She eased back into her seat. The gesture itself was a sermon. The captain's jaw moved once and stopped. He was careful with anger. He had learned long ago that open anger makes a uniform look small. Still, something in him wanted the old speed, the old obedience. He lifted his chin and spoke into that habit. "I am the captain," he said, "and on this aircraft, my authority is absolute." Hayes answered without heat. "The law is absolute," he said. "Your authority is lawful when it aligns with it." The sound that followed was not applause. It was the sound of a room discovering its balance. People who might have looked down in other years now looked straight ahead. A father traveling with a 10-year-old son squeezed a small shoulder beside him, as if to mark the place in memory where dignity had been spoken simply. A grandmother 2 rows back whispered that she would be writing to the airline and to the agency in Washington, whose forms she had filled out for other reasons in other seasons. In their mouths, the names of institutions sounded like tools rather than walls. Emily stepped half a pace forward and placed herself at Angela's side. The move was not theatrical. It redrew the diagram crew and passenger shoulder to shoulder beside the rule. "Captain," she said, voice kind and unequivocal, "we can request a gate return and consult policy in writing." I will document what I have observed. It is the cleanest path. He looked at her the way a man looks at a colleague whose good sense may cost him a win. The muscles at his temple ticked. He had made a career of being decisive in weather, of pointing an aircraft's nose toward trouble and rising above it, but he stood now in weather that did not yield to thrust. The room had become a town square, and choices made in town squares do not vanish when the door closes. He picked up the interphone again, put it down again, and tried a different language, the language of pressure. "We will be late," he said to no one and everyone. "Connections will be missed. Families will wait." "Mosey," a voice from the middle of the cabin answered the way America sometimes answers its own better angels. "We can wait for one another," the woman said. "We have learned how." Angela listened to all of it without becoming the center of it. She turned to Emily and asked for water. It was the most ordinary request she could make and the most dignified. Emily poured from the pitcher into a plastic cup and handed it to her as if serving at the dining room rather than in a contested aisle. Angela thanked her, sipped, and set the cup down inside a small ring. The cup clicked once. It sounded like a seal. Turner found courage enough to shift his own place by a fraction. He leaned toward the aisle and, with more humility than he had shown all evening, said, "Ma'am, if there is a way I can help with your documentation when this lands, I will do it." It was not a confession. It was an amendment. Angela met the offer with a slight nod. She bore him no grudge and no special gratitude. Adults, after all, can learn. Jason reported the turn with precision. The audience responded with stories. A bus route where a driver refused to skip a stop no matter who asked. A hospital where a charge nurse spoke for a patient who had no advocate. A courthouse where a clerk insisted that the line was a law and the law was a line. The stream's count ticked upward again, described by Jason only as a measure, not a chant. He avoided the word crowd. He preferred the word witnesses. Momentum changed clothes. Instead of urgency in the captain's tone, the cabin wore patience. Instead of impatience in the businessman's posture, the row wore attention. You could feel it in small things. People folded their coats more neatly. They accepted water. They spoke to one another in full sentences. Flame had become coals, and coals warm a room more lastingly than fire. The captain stepped forward once more, because stepping forward is what he knew. He raised his voice just enough to fill the space without rattling its windows. "We cannot run a flight by committee," he said. "Chain of command exists for a reason." Hayes answered, calm as a checklist. "So do the regulations," he said. "They are the chain. We hold them or we fall." For a heartbeat, the airplane was a chapel again. Emily glanced at the cabin door as if to confirm that the world still waited outside like a patient neighbor. She looked back at Angela and then at the passengers who had found their own best selves in the space of 10 quiet minutes. You could see her choose where to stand, not just with her feet, but with her future. She drew a breath that tasted like decision. "Seat 2 Alpha is valid," she said, plainly enough for the first 3 rows to hear and carry down the aisle. "The passenger remains." The sentence shifted air. It allowed people to exhale. It also made a sound that microphones like to catch. Jason did not repeat it. He let the room do that. A traveler in row 4 said it again to the row behind him. A teacher in row 5 did the same. The phrase moved with the rhythm of confirmation rather than defiance. Blake stared at Emily for half a second as if she had pulled a lever he had not seen. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He only reached toward the interphone with the slow precision of a man counting consequences and picked it up like a weight. Before his thumb found the button, Angela spoke for the cabin as gently as a bell. "We can return to the gate," she said. "We can make this correct." He held her eyes for a breath. Then he nodded. The smallest bow a man can make to a fact. He pressed the button and requested the return. His voice kept its steadiness. Pride bent to policy, and the room felt the relief that follows a good surrender. The airplane rocked minutely as ground crew answered. A tug moved into place. In economy, a child cheered at the sensation of going backward. You could feel the ship turn in its berth. You could feel a story turn with it. Emily whispered to Angela that her note would be thorough. Angela thanked her and asked that any crew statement include the moments where invitation became insistence and insistence declined to name itself. Emily nodded, grateful to be asked for the very thing she had promised herself to do. Hayes resumed his seat with the dignity of a man who has taught the cockpit another way to hold the sky. Martha rested a hand on her purse and closed her eyes for one long breath that might have been prayer or might have been rest. Turner scrolled through his calendar and, for once, did not try to bend the day to his will. He typed a message to his dinner partner that was short and responsible. Running late, will explain, please start without me. The words felt new in his mouth. Jason told the stream what the tug meant, how gate returns work, how policies that sound bureaucratic in abstract become a blessing when used well. He avoided words that would paint heroes and villains in thick strokes. He let the cabin remain a room full of people who had done one careful thing together. They had asked for a reason, and when it did not come, they had paused the world just long enough to right the course. The captain replaced the handset and looked down the aisle at the faces that had met him without panic. His shoulders lowered by a fraction, as if some portion of the weight he carried had finally migrated to the part of him strong enough to hold it. He did not apologize. That would come if it came in another room. But he did not reassert what had been withdrawn. He waited for the return and the paperwork that awaited him, for the phone calls and the meetings and the mirrors that would ask him a question he alone could answer. Angela reached for her water again and drank. The plastic flexed quietly in her hand. She set it back in the ring and rested her palm beside the boarding pass. Her face held composure without the stiffness of victory. She had not come to win. She had come to fly. Sometimes justice, like travel, requires an unscheduled stop. A crisp tone from the speaker signaled ground movement. The plane eased inches at a time, then feet, then a measured yard. The window view traded one section of tarmac for another. People adjusted their coats again, practiced patience as if it were a shared language. Someone behind Jason whispered that this will be one for the papers. Someone else said that it was one for the children. The captain took one step into the aisle, perhaps to check a latch, perhaps to inhabit the room he would soon have to leave to process forms and choices. His presence no longer pressed against the passengers. It moved alongside them. That, too, is a kind of authority. Then a different light bloomed, not from the ceiling or the panels, but from the passengers themselves, as the room did something that felt inevitable and new at once. Phones across the cabin lit at once, dozens of passengers raising their cameras, turning the captain into a man being tried before the public. The cabin adjusted to the new gravity of consequence as the airplane rolled back toward the gate. Ground crew lanterns winked through the snowfall. The tug hummed like a patient animal doing useful work. Angela Carter sipped water and watched the faces settle into the quiet that follows a hard truth named aloud. The return did not feel like defeat. It felt like the necessary step of people who had remembered how rules are supposed to hold. When the door opened and the supervisor boarded with a clipboard and a measured tone, the business cabin behaved like a town hall, steady and civil. Emily Rodriguez gave a succinct account of what she had witnessed, careful with each verb. Robert Hayes provided his name and background without ceremony and affirmed, in plain words, that safety had never been invoked. Martha Johnson spoke softly and said that dignity had been protected. Michael Turner signed his name to a short statement and did not add commentary. Jason Nguyen lowered his phone for a moment and told his viewers that sometimes doing the right thing looks like paperwork and patience. The captain remained composed as he conferred with the supervisor. He did not argue in public. He did not ask for sympathy. He listened, nodded, and stepped forward to address the room with the voice of a man who knows whether he cannot outfly. He announced that a replacement crew would operate the flight. He said the words efficiently and without apology, and in their steadiness, the passengers heard a kind of admission that mattered more than an argument would have. Emily thanked the cabin for its patience. The supervisor thanked the cabin for its cooperation. It sounded like a ritual done correctly. During the changeover, the plane became an unusual community, half waiting room and half church. People stretched their legs, but no one grew loud. Angela closed her laptop and rested her palm on the cover. She did not look like a victor. She looked like a person ready to go where she was going. A message pulsed onto her phone from a colleague in Washington. We saw the stream. Are you all right? She typed a brief reply that fit the hour and the room. I am safe. We are returning to procedure. Across the aisle, Turner composed his own note to the dinner partners he had ranked earlier above patience. He wrote that he would arrive late and that he appreciated their flexibility. The sentence must have felt new in his mouth, but it landed true. News traveled as news does now, quietly and everywhere at once. Jason, careful with names and facts, confirmed to his viewers that a formal review would follow and that the agency in Washington might request the footage. He encouraged anyone watching to respect the crew and to treat the comments as a record, not a bonfire. A retired mechanic wrote that checklists exist to save you on your worst day. A school librarian wrote that she would play the audio for her students and ask them what courage sounds like. The counter of witnesses climbed in smooth steps and then slowed, as if the story had found the right size of attention and decided to hold there. When the new captain and first officer boarded, the mood in the cabin rose by a small but perceptible degree. Greetings were plain, procedures exact. The new captain's voice over the speakers carried the authority of someone whose sentences were used to sharing space with the law. Good evening. We appreciate your patience. We will depart as soon as we receive clearance. It was the voice of a steward rather than a sheriff, and the cabin answered with an exhale that felt like a collective uncoiling. Angela closed her eyes for a breath, then opened them to the snow-beaded window and the reflection of her own face looking back, steady as a horizon. Clearance came, as clearance does, in the language of numbers and letters, and the quiet handshake between tower and cockpit. The tug disconnected, the aircraft pushed back. A child in economy laughed at the sense of motion returning to the world. Taxiway lights drew a dotted line toward the runway. The new first officer's announcements were practical and kind. Emily moved down the aisle with water as if she had been allowed to return to her vocation, which is to make a metal room feel like a place fit for people. Martha folded her scarf more snugly, closed her eyes, and rested. Takeoff at night is not drama so much as release. The engines gather themselves and spoke in the voice that launches cities into sky. The runway's lights became a river. The cabin leaned into ascent. The weight under everyone's ribs eased. Chicago fell away, a necklace of street lamps and storefronts, and porches where latecomers brushed snow from shoulders. Jason turned off his stream and placed the phone face down. A small private ritual of respect for the fact that not every mile should be public. Angela watched the wing carve into the darkness and felt the ordinary wonder of a climb carried out exactly by the book. At altitude, the room regained its kindness. Some passengers dozed, some read. The pair of business travelers spoke in the low tones of men, revising a memo in light of a better fact. Turner wrote, then rewrote, a message to a younger colleague about the meeting he would now miss. He chose the word reschedule instead of cancel. He added, this was the right call. Emily checked belts and blankets with a practiced glance, and when she reached Angela's row, paused just long enough to say that her statement would include the moment where invitation became insistence. Angela thanked her and told her that her steadiness had made a difference. Emily accepted the compliment without deflecting it and moved on with a small half-smile that looked like a decision held. The seatbelt sign chimed off. The cart's small wheels whispered. Someone ordered hot tea and asked for honey. Someone else accepted water and said please and thank you twice. The new captain spoke again, noting light turbulence and a smooth arrival estimate into the capital. He sounded like a man escorting a room of neighbors across a river rather than a commander leading troops, and that too felt right. The aircraft, for all its metal bones and serious systems, behaved like a patient animal given clear cues. Angela leaned her head back and let tiredness touch her at last. In the soft borderland between thought and sleep, she drafted, not in her laptop this time, but on the inside of her mind, the sentence she would say in Washington the next day. It would be simple. The point of procedure is dignity. Without it, authority becomes a weather system that ruins harvests. With it, authority becomes air you do not have to think about. She would describe what had happened and what had not. She would name the weight that words can carry when spoken with respect, and the lift that communities can give when they pause a machine long enough to remember what it is for. By the time the cabin lights glowed warmer for descent, a handful of passengers had sent messages to friends describing the evening in paragraphs rather than exclamations. In living rooms and kitchens along the eastern corridor, televisions and radios carried the phrase Thanksgiving Flight of Justice in the cadence of anchors, trained to keep surprise out of their voices. The agency in Washington sent a notice acknowledging receipt of preliminary information. The airline drafted a statement written by a hand that had learned, in a long hour, the tone of accountability. None of it felt like victory. It felt like repair. Wheels met runway with a kiss that made the business cabin sigh. Washington's lights approached as if borne by careful hands. When the door opened at the gate, the air on the jet bridge was softer than Chicago's, and the airport carried the late-night songs of cleaners and cab lines and families reuniting despite the clock. Passengers filed out with the dignity they had agreed on together. Several nodded to Angela without words. Hayes touched the brim of an imaginary cap and said he would submit his statement in the morning. Martha squeezed Angela's hand with the strength of a woman who had held a great many hands at many thresholds. At baggage claim, Turner stepped close enough to be heard without crowding. He apologized without adjectives and offered to write what he had seen. He did not explain his earlier impatience. Angela thanked him, not as absolution, but as acknowledgement that an adult had made a better choice at the second chance. Emily passed by with a small stack of forms and a promise to email a copy of her report. Her smile now looked like a promise kept to herself. In a quiet corner near the exits, Jason ended the record with a final note to his viewers, then closed the app and breathed. He had not tried to make a story out of a person. He had kept a ledger. He hoped someday to tell his children that this is what a room can do when it insists on reasons. He tucked the phone into his jacket and joined the flow toward the rideshare signs bobbing like small beacons above the crowd. Angela stepped into the night air and felt the capital's particular mixture of seriousness and hospitality. A taxi rolled forward. The driver greeted her with a simple good evening and asked about the route. She gave him the cross streets for a small hotel near a park lined with leafless elms, thanked him, and settled into the rhythm of the city moving under streetlights. She drafted in her mind, and then in a quick email on her phone, the founding note of a project she had decided on somewhere over Ohio, Carter Initiative for Passenger Dignity. The first lines proposed practical steps clear signage for rights, a hotline routed to people who could actually help, brief trainings for crews on how to hold authority in open hands. The signature she typed without ceremony. It did not feel like a brand. It felt like a list of chores before breakfast. In the morning, she would meet with colleagues and staffers and explain the night with fewer words than it had taken to live it. She would keep the names of helpful strangers and note the steadiness of a flight attendant who had chosen the route over ease. She would ask for small changes, the kind that add up. She would drink coffee and answer questions about procedure and keep her voice level even when the room tried to make a character of her. She had not asked to be an example. She had asked for the reason, yet even as the taxi turned onto a broad avenue that pointed toward the river, Angela understood that some evenings take hold. They joined a chain of other evenings when people stood where they were supposed to stand and held fast. She thought of Martha's scarf, of Hayes' pen, of Emily's hands, steadying the cart as if it were a plowshare. She thought of a cabin that had found its balance and then its way. She thought of how history sometimes feels like a chorus that anyone can join, provided they sing the note of their own integrity. She checked into the hotel with the uncomplicated kindness of night clerks who have seen every kind of traveler and wish them all the same rest. In the elevator, she leaned against the wall for a single breath, then stood straight and stepped into a room that smelled faintly of citrus and clean linen. She set her tote on the chair, took off her shoes, washed her face, and stood at the window long enough to watch the city, mark the hour with a siren far away and a bus stopping under a street lamp. She opened her laptop only to send the formal report with attachments, then closed it again and let the screen go dark with the satisfaction of work completed for the day. Before sleep, she typed one last message to the small list of people she trusted to hold her story without bending it. We will ask for better forms and kinder scripts. We will ask for crews to be trained to say the reason first. We will make it easy for passengers to add their voices. It will be work, not theater. She hit send and put the phone on the nightstand. The room answered with quiet. Somewhere over the country she had just crossed. The late departures and the overnight freighters traced their lines through the cold. The aircraft that had carried her climbed again toward its own next dawn with a room full of other names and other errands, and she felt only gratitude for that ordinary fact. She lay back, turned out the bedside lamp, and let the city keep its watch. On the dark sky, the airplane's lights blinked, hinting that Angela's journey had only just begun. On that winter night, a plane full of strangers discovered that dignity can be defended in the quietest of ways. What began as a single woman asking for a reason became a chorus of calm voices, proving that fairness, when spoken together, can steady even the strongest currents of power. The lesson was clear. Justice is not born from anger, but from patience, persistence, and the courage to ask for truth. In our own lives, we may not sit in cabins or face uniforms, but we each encounter moments where explanation is owed and kindness is due. Like a lantern lit in the stillness of night, even the smallest act of integrity can guide others safely forward. If this story has touched you, take a moment to pass that light along through a kind word, a listening ear, or the simple act of standing steady when someone else cannot.